Hey folks, David Stewart here. A couple of days ago, I got to see Incredibles 2 in the theaters, and I thought I would go ahead and do a review and analysis of that movie for you. Here's what you need to know for review purposes. If you liked Incredibles 1, chances are you're going to like Incredibles 2. The movie is written and directed by the same person who wrote and directed the first Incredibles, that is Brad Bird, and he's a very competent filmmaker. He knows how to construct a good story where the setting, characters, and plot all work together really, really well. And he knows how to execute it on screen as well, using a lot of great cinematography techniques, especially those from live action, brought into a unique animation style that's pretty pleasant to look at. I will say, however, that I don't think you're going to lose a whole lot if you happen to catch this one on video. While it's a visually good movie and the cinematography in it is good, the animation's good, and it's very appealing in terms of sound, soundtrack, and visual design, I don't think these are things that lose anything by watching them on TV. So if you're just a middling fan and you're not really anticipating this movie, you're going to be fine watching it on video. Now, here's what I want to say, getting into a little bit of a deeper analysis of this movie. There's going to be some spoilers from here on out. So if you don't want those, you probably have enough information at hand to make a decision whether or not you want to see Incredibles 2. Here's what you need to know about how Incredibles 1 works. I have one big negative criticism that I'm going to lead with, and that is that it's incredibly similar to Incredibles 1. It is kind of like a very sequelish kind of movie, and it's similar in more ways than just it has the same look, it has the same characters. The story and the beats of the story and the themes of the story are almost a complete copy of the first movie. You have a setup where you have characters, you have superheroes are illegal. That's the big setup of both movies. You have an introductory sequence that shows you the heroes and their powers and introduces the idea that heroes are going to be illegal. You have one parent, and in this case, in both movies, it's the same parent, Bob, or Mr. Incredible, who's working a job that he doesn't feel is appropriate for him as a superhero, that as a superhero, he ought to be doing something important. In the first movie, it's working this awful insurance job that wants him to be dishonest. In the second movie, it's being dad. Now, that kind of setup could easily have gone into a very man-bashing area, but it actually doesn't, and that's because Brad Bird is very good at handling his characters and showing his characters as virtuous and complete individuals who act according to their natures and according to their strengths and weaknesses. So for Bob Parr, for Mr. Incredible, being dad is a big adjustment, and it's one that he's initially unprepared for, especially when it comes to having to help kids with homework and deal with the needs of a baby with like superpowers. But it's one where he rises to the task and ends up enjoying what he's doing because he's able to embrace his role, if you will. So it's actually a very family positive movie in that respect. And one of the things I like about both Incredibles movies, they're very pro-family. They don't show a dysfunctional family. The family's highly functional, but they're in a situation that puts stress on them, and they deal with that stress and they deal with the danger as a family, caring for each other. There's never really a question of the marriage failing, even in the first movie where that's a little bit of a device, is that he's secretly going behind his wife's back to be a superhero, not to cheat on her. In this one, that's not really it. It's just tension over the danger of being a superhero and wanting to be something that you're kind of meant to be on the inside. And overall, it's pretty well executed. There's a great triangle there. You have the setting and the setup of the setting. It's sort of vintage modern. It feels like the 60s. The soundtrack really reinforces that setting. And the soundtrack's actually quite a lot of fun. It's a big band style soundtrack. It's very similar to the soundtracks of the Despicable Me movies, in that they're trying to harken back to the sounds of a James Bond movie from the 60s or 70s, or even a modern James Bond movie that has a big band sound, but with guitars, with a lot of rock feel stuff mixed in there. And overall, it's a good soundtrack, and it enhances this feeling that you're watching something maybe from like the silver or golden age of comics, just an older version of America, even though there's a lot of modern technology that's used and mixed in there. So he starts with that, and from that setting arises the characters, the heroes. and their struggle is based on the problems of the setting, which is that heroes cause destruction, and people are very critical of them not performing perfectly every time. So it's a little bit of a play on the trope of superheroes, and then the plot arises then from that. So the plot centers around, in this movie and the first movie, it centers around one character getting to work as a superhero, which is something they really want to do because that's like their inner being. In this case, they're working as a superhero to try to promote public interest in superheroes and get them back over ground so they can be doing their superhero jobs. So it's a little bit of a bigger goal than the first movie, which was for Bob to just be able to be a superhero. In this case, it's his wife. It's Elastigirl that's going to be the superhero, but there's a bigger goal in mind. You have a villain that is responding to that goal. So in the first movie, the villain is responding to the goal of superheroes by wanting to be one himself and be the best one, even though he has no powers. Like, his power is going to be his technology that he creates. In this one, it's somebody that's opposed to superheroes because they consider superheroes something that makes people weak, that makes them dependent on some sort of authority to save them. And indeed, the main bad guy manipulates people through television and is at the same time critical of the medium of television. So it's an interesting duality, and there's some interesting messages all kind of weaved in there. And one of the things that I think makes this movie work is the fact that you have one writer, one director, and that person is Brad Bird. And because you have one person with creative control, and he's a very competent person, he's able to work all those things out. I have a feeling, and this is something I notice again and again in movies, this is the pattern I notice: the more writers are involved in the production of a script, the worse the movie gets. In fact, one of the things that I think made, say, the Hobbit trilogy worse than the Lord of the Rings trilogy was the fact that it got transformed too many times before it was shot and finally went to screen. You had like Guillermo del Toro working on it initially, and then eventually Peter Jackson was doing it again with Fran Walsh, and before you know it, you're looking at the screenwriting credits and there's like 7-8 people involved with all of the story creation and things like that. And that's probably too many for like an entire vision to be withheld. So in this case, Brad Bird writing and directing it, he's able to not only write the story that he wants to write, but understand how he's going to execute it on screen. So everything ends up working really well together, even though the plot and even the pacing of the plot and the plot points, they feel like a repetition of the first movie. That's my criticism. It doesn't feel different enough from the first movie, but it's so well executed you almost don't care. And because the characters are so likable, you're okay just seeing them do more of the things that you're used to with that. So overall, the movie gets presented really well. I'm going to skip the scores for this because it really is, it's an animated movie, and it's very good for an animated movie in terms of its production capabilities. The sound design, obviously, it's not going to be on the level of a Star Wars movie or anything of that caliber, and nor is it intended to be. But it's a good movie. It's fun for kids. I think it's actually very family positive, and it had many opportunities to not be. There's also some interesting messages contained within the movie that I'd like to point out. One is that you have this villain who uses television to control people. And while she's using screens to control people, or he or she is using screens to control people, I'm giving away spoilers, so who cares? While that's happening, there's a criticism against watching TV. And there's this weird irony when you're watching a movie and it's almost criticizing you for spending too much time on media, but people become dependent on media to gain information. People become dependent on TV to gain experience. They're not out living life. They're not out taking risks, and the villain doesn't like that. So the villain has this truth that's carrying the villain's motivation forward, and they really want to prevent superheroes from being a thing because they see that as another thing that people are going to be dependent on. And this is a case where the villain's motives are quite understandable, but of course the methods are where it becomes really dastardly and quite wicked, using really dishonest methods to try to manipulate people's opinion of superheroes, while trying to get them off of a media that manipulates them. So there's an interesting duality there, a bit of a crisis. So there's that message which runs through the entire movie. And then there's also the message of there's a point where there's criticism against public schools and the way those work. When Mr. Incredible is sitting down doing homework with his son, there's these jokes about Common Core math. He's like, this is how we have to do math, and we have to show our work, and it has to be done this way. He's like, why do they change math? Math is math. Math should be done the way that math has always been done. Do it so that you get the right answer. You know, it's a very practical assessment of this. But even encapsulated within that moment, the laughable criticism of some modern ways of trying to teach kids how to process math. You get a criticism against the schools themselves because the father is having to teach these concepts to his son because the teacher did not teach the concepts to the son, but is requiring him to do assignments and to certify a grade in math, even though he hasn't done any remediation or anything like that. So it's the parent that ends up picking up all the slack for the teacher not only teaching weird concepts, but just not teaching them or really not bothering to remediate the student at all. And that's a really common parent experience. If you talk to a lot of parents with kids that have been in schools, that the kid brings some homework that they have no idea how to do. The teacher doesn't realize that the kids don't know how to do it, but the teacher's still requiring a grade. And a lot of teachers are not self-critical enough to look at a bunch of students who aren't able to do an assignment and think, well, how do I remediate them? How do I fix that knowledge gap that they have? Or how did I fail in explaining the lesson that so many people didn't get the assignment? A lot of teachers will just happily give a lot of people low grades without really thinking about it or bothering to try to teach to mastery or do something like that. So it's an interesting moment there. There's some great little moments with teenage relationships and teenage angst and the awkwardness of parents like trying to understand that. All of that stuff, I think, plays into some very common sympathies that parents have towards their kids, as well as parents just being exhausted from kids not having common sleep schedules. In the case of Mr. Incredible, he literally can't contain his son. His son is able to like teleport. His baby's able to teleport outside and like fight raccoons with superpowers. It's like impossible for him to keep up to really keep up with this child. And by the end of it, he like conquers this challenge, that he finds the challenge of being able to be like an effective and good parent is one that he takes on and is able to overcome. And that could have been an opportunity to like male bash men, because that's tends to be what happens lately. But if you look far enough in the past, there's plenty of the same imagery with women being extremely tired, having to deal with kids and having to do homework and that sort of thing. So it really has more to do with the role of having to be the primary care provider for children when your spouse is absent or away working, versus something that's specifically to do with sex roles. And Bob's role as a man is he's used to being not only just going out and working, but also being a superhero out in society, being a high achiever, and being at home is something this doesn't really gel with his nature. So it's an interesting little subplot. That's the main B story, if you will. The A story is the Elastigirl trying to catch the bad guy. The B story is Bob trying to figure out how to be a good dad and end up enjoying his role. And then you have some other little C stories with like a little teenage romance. It's a very good example of an ABC execution of a story, but a lot of people won't be aware of it or won't think that much of it because it's not as obvious, and it's not as obvious because of the execution. More and more, I watch movies and I realize that the difference between a quality movie and a piece of crap is mostly in the execution, not in the concept. So the fact that Brad Bird is operating from almost a pretty stiff formula, the same formula he used in the first movie, doesn't stop it from being an effective movie, partially because all of the techniques he uses to fulfill that are there. He uses a lot of cinematography techniques from live action that are effective, including some moments from that would fit very well in a horror movie, that can produce some genuine tension and some genuine scares. There's a lot to the movie that should be praised for its execution, not just its story writing. But all those things have to work well together, and I think that's the benefit of having a competent, experienced creator like Brad Bird having the reins on on a movie like Incredibles 2, it ended up producing what I would consider a very competently produced product, one that I think most your typical moviegoer will actually enjoy, and one that I think a lot of people might enjoy on video, particularly if they like animated movies that are more focused for family viewing, or they enjoyed the first Incredibles. So thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little bit of analysis on the story, and if you like what you see, please don't hesitate to let me know. Let me know what you want to see in the comments in the future. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, you can find more of my work at deviouspress.com. If you want to check out my books, they're all there, and all the links to Amazon are there. I'm always appreciative of people reading them. You can support me by giving me $1 on Patreon, patreon.com/DavidVStewart. Find me on Twitter, twitter.com/DavidVStewart. And I appreciate it, and I will see you guys next time.